Good morning, everyone. No challenge, follow that. A fantastic start to day two of our conference. Welcome, everybody. My name's Steve Gourley. I'm with the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, sit on the Community Planning Partnership. And my co-host today is Mary Simpson from the Health and Social Care Partnership. So today we are going to have a very similar format to yesterday, where we saw a range of fantastic presentations and a couple of very interesting and worthwhile workshops. So today is going to follow the same theme or themes, but before we get started, worth remembering that questions are available throughout on Slido. So you can ask the questions on the right-hand side of your screen. When we are moving to the workshops, they'll be accessed the same as they were yesterday through Zoom. And to access these sessions, simply click on the Zoom chat button at the top of your screen when we tell you to do so and enter the password you were provided with in your learning instructions. You also find a note of that password in the description box below. I'm going to hand over to Mary now. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. That music gave me goosebumps. Who would have thought 2 years ago you could perform like that from everybody's own individual rooms? It's fabulous. We're now going to see some of the photos that you shared overnight, having been at the conference yesterday. So we'll just see some of these now. I think that's maybe us back to the beginning. It just shows what a kind of diverse and different area we have, and how beautiful it is in so many aspects. Some of the key things that struck me were there was quite a lot of focus there about learning. We saw some schools and also looking at adult learning and some apprenticeship work as well. Also some workplaces, and I think acknowledging how workplaces have changed over the last 2 years is important. Having spent a lot of time on Skye, I was really impressed at the photo of everybody on the farm and learning to use a scythe. I don't know, unless you've tried to pick up a scythe, you can appreciate how heavy they are. There's no way I could use one, but that was really good to see. That's from Dam Head. The other thing that came through was the sense of community, lots of things about community. I think that was probably a picture of the beacon at Gore Bridge and other areas of community. And again, that's really important to what we're about today, but also to Midlothian. I think that's something that is a strong feature of Midlothian. And despite my public health background, I cannot but acknowledge the cakes. And if anybody thinks public health means you don't eat cakes, then they're wrong. And I think that's part of being community and being sociable. And anybody will know from our service anyway that cakes are quite a big feature, so it was really nice to see that there as well. So thanks very much for sending the photos in. I think they show the diversity of what we're about and what the area is as well. So thank you for that, and these will be available later if anybody wants to see them. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Grace Vickers, who's going to talk to us about the wellbeing economy and inequalities.
Thank you, Mary, and indeed, Steve, to yourself and Mary for being our host today, and wonderful to start today's session with such beautiful music from our children and young people, and also the photographs across Midlothian. The presentation that I want to share this morning, I hope will chime with the conversations that took place yesterday in the workshops and indeed the presentations. And I wanted to talk to you this morning about a wellbeing economy. And Councillor Muirhead referenced yesterday the maturity of our community planning partnership and how well we work together. And indeed, right at the beginning of lockdown, the week before lockdown happened, we actually took a community planning partnership approach and we all really mucked in together to make a difference. And this is why I think that we are at a point as a community planning partnership that we could do something really special in the form of creating a wellbeing economy. And I don't want to oversimplify this morning how challenging this would be to do, but I thought in order to make clear what a wellbeing economy is about, if I broke it down into 3 different parts, it might make a bit of sense, and hopefully people would begin to see the work that we're doing and how that chimes with the ambitions of a wellbeing economy. So I wanted to talk you through what a wellbeing economy actually is, what steps the Council have been taking to begin to set the scene for the creation of a wellbeing economy, and what practical steps the CPB, us collectively together, could take. So in terms of a definition, put simply, a wellbeing economy really is an economy where both people and the planet flourish. And that's really important given that we hosted COP26, given our climate change ambitions. We want to make sense of doing the very best for our people, but also the environment around us. And the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Scotland believes really strongly that humans should determine economics, not the other way around. And they've got a really lovely photo in one of their brochures, and really that's a whole island that's flooded, and they've got people swimming about and they're saying to each other, well, at least we've got the economy. And that just put it absolutely so well for me that actually we really need to start investing in the environment. But what I loved about the work of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Scotland was they have distilled the complicated nature of a wellbeing economy into 5 non-negotiables. And this is what I wanted to share with you today, because I really think that this strikes at the heart of what we're about as a CPP. So they say, firstly, the non-negotiable is dignity, and that everyone has enough to live in comfort, safety, and happiness. And we talked a lot during the pandemic about food banks, and really was there dignity in going to food banks. And we talked a lot about what could we do around that. So I've got a few ideas that I'll show you in the last slide. Nature, they talk about a non-negotiable being a restored and safe natural world for all. That's people and all animals. Thirdly, they talk about connection and that sense of belonging and institutions that serve the common good. And we really sense that belongingness through the pictures there. And certainly as a CPP, that sense of belonging is really important for all of us in Midlothian. Their fourth non-negotiable is something we talk a lot about, and that's fairness. And they say justice in all its dimensions at the heart of economic systems, and the gap between the richest and the poorest greatly reduced. And as developed nations, we try a lot to make that happen. But actually, what we're seeing across the world is that gap getting wider as opposed to getting narrower. And their fifth non-negotiable is participation, where citizens are actively engaged in their community and locally rooted economies. So really chimes with the 20-minute neighbourhood model we were talking about yesterday. So 5 non-negotiables they propose: dignity, nature, connection, fairness, and participation. So being a fan of the wellbeing economy, I wanted to talk about a few steps that we've taken in Midlothian. So back in 2019, and you may think I'm mad for what I'm about to say, but we took a major step change and we approved a medium-term financial strategy. That took it away from year in, year out budget making. So that's what we used to do. But actually there's sense in that because you don't know what monies you're getting from the Scottish Government in order to then determine your budget. But we gained cross-party support for that medium-term financial strategy, and it meant we were setting budgets over a longer period. But that doesn't therefore mean you've got a wellbeing economy. That just proves you can plan over a longer term period. And that was important as a first step if we're thinking about what are the key ingredients we need in order to create a wellbeing economy. And in June 2020, we took a major step and we published the route map. And on the right-hand side of the screen, I've just got a bit of a screen grab of that because it's built on our 9 drivers of change. And in that route map, we were saying up front, we want to adopt a wellbeing economy. And that was really quite different. And I have to say, in the CPP, we've always taken that approach where early intervention and prevention are key principles for us. So it chimes really well with the wellbeing economy. And in August 2020, we took the climate change strategy to council, and again, that was approved. And we talked about that yesterday in the presentation, but actually, we've only got 9 years left in order to meet that huge ambition of being carbon neutral by 2030. And in June, just there, we approved the digital strategy. And that's important because we're going to need all the digital tools that we can in order to make this a reality. And on the right-hand side, as I said, we've got our 9 drivers for change. We hope to include within that the local by default, the 20-minute neighbourhoods, the asset-based approach about valuing the communities and local people feeling valued, sustainable futures, and that hub and spoke model that we're talking about. But most importantly for me is the first driver, and that is holistic solutions. Being one council with joined up services, and we're absolutely not there yet, but we need to be joined up CPP as well if we're going to truly create a wellbeing economy. So this is what I thought we could use to stimulate a bit of the conversation today. And what practical steps really could we take collectively if we were really interested in a wellbeing economy? So together with our climate change pledge that we talked about yesterday, that really is our overarching aim that feeds into every single one of our work streams in the CPP, our 3 really important priorities are to reduce inequalities in health outcomes, in educational outcomes, but also economic circumstances. But could we begin to take that work a bit further by adopting the 5 non-negotiables that are explained as part of the wellbeing economy to create a new Fairer Together Midlothian partnership? And that would pull everything into one holistic ambition that we're all really signed up to. So a Fairer Together Midlothian pledge, for example, or a Fairer Together Midlothian partnership. So in order to do that, the dignity and fairness non-negotiable, for example, we could take that to tackle food and fuel poverty collectively. And I don't know if anybody was watching the Climate Change Awards, and they featured a case study from Milan, which was really interesting because in Milan, they wanted to both eliminate food waste at the same time as making sure that no one went to bed hungry. And they actually found out that they could achieve both. And it reduced food waste massively, and it made sure that everybody were working as a cooperative to make sure that everybody was well fed. So a really good example of where people and the planet are flourishing. That's something, for example, that we could adopt. It'd be difficult to do, but I think given the size of Midlothian, it's something that we could achieve because across the CPP partnership, we have everybody we need involved to make that a reality. Nature and participation is the next one, but I do think we really need to accelerate our climate change work. As I said in the previous slide, we've really got 9 years to be carbon neutral by 2030, and I don't think we can underestimate how challenging that's going to be, and actually the number of habits that we're going to have to change to make that possible. And connection, a sense of belonging, and locally rooted economies. And we talked yesterday a lot about the 20-minute neighbourhood idea, but is that something that we want to adopt collectively as a CPP? So really my ask today is a bit of consideration about, could we take a holistic approach to tie together all of the ambitions that we actually have? I'm not underestimating how challenging this is going to be to actually achieve. And no country in the world has achieved a wellbeing economy yet. There's a lot of work happening across Scotland. There's a lot of work happening in Iceland. There's a lot of work happening in New Zealand, but nobody's yet cracked it. So in Midlothian, could we be small enough, and do we work collectively enough with the same principles that we share to make this happen? I would like to think that we could, but again, that's something really to stimulate discussion. And by no means are the three boxes at the bottom the whole picture, but was just really meant to stimulate a bit of conversation. So Steve, Mary, that's the end of my presentation, and happy to take any questions before we move into our workshops.
Thank you very much, Grace. Just looking on Slido, we've not, you'll be glad to know, not got any questions. There may still be people frantically typing, but we do have a comment. We could start by abandoning the policy of taking land out of the green belt. Just a suggestion. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
I think these are all really good questions, Steve, and I think COP26 really crystallised, didn't it, the work that we need to do collectively and how all of these different policies interrelate with one another. So this won't just be council policies, this would need to be Scottish Government policies, UK Government policies, and I don't think that we can underestimate the challenge at hand to unpick quite a lot of that work to make this a reality.
We've got a comment just saying holistic is the only way forward. But apart from that, I think that might be you finished. I think the important bit I took from that was translating some of the strategy into actual practical steps, and you referenced that around making a difference, and particularly with a focus on the early intervention and prevention, which I suppose it's 10 years plus since the Christie report, and that early intervention prevention was all the work that was pushed out from that, and it still needs to be a focus. We can't solve communities' issues without focusing on those. So, we've got a couple of questions popped up. What do you see as the key barriers to 20 minutes happening?
So Midlothian's quite different, all the distinct communities, isn't it? And I think we really need to take a closer look at everything that we want within that 20-minute area. There are good examples where we have that happening, and I think certainly the workshop that I was in yesterday, there were great examples coming through, and I think that that's something, if we really want to do it, there's an opportunity to grab hold of that and really map the kinds of services that we're looking for and really try to make that happen. One of our 9 drivers is change. One size fits one, and I think it's important that we recognise the distinctiveness, the uniqueness of each of the communities that make up Midlothian, and that's really the magic of Midlothian, isn't it? How different our individual communities are, and there's a real, I think, interest within the CPP, certainly in the workshop that I was in yesterday, where people are interested in that, and certainly the workshop that happened, Annette, that I was sent through some of the feedback about the 20-minute communities model. There were a lot of great examples in there, Steve, that I think that we could harness and begin to map out those services.
Okay, when I said you were getting off lightly, I think that might have changed. We've got quite a few questions starting to come in now, so but we've got plenty of time. So if you're okay, we can get a few more questions in. How can we provide communities more decision making in what is important locally to them?
So I think through the CPP, that's a real role that we could have. We also, as a council, asked Nesta to do some work for us, and people met Christine yesterday. So really to start that conversation and begin to prioritise what's important to each and every one of us. What I would say is, moving forward, I don't think that we're going to have more resources in the way of cash. This is going to be about how we want to prioritise and utilise things. And I think the holistic approach is really important there, to begin to tie up all of our strategies and to really look at those 2 key ingredients where we ask ourselves that key question: if we take these decisions, does that mean that our people and our planet are going to flourish? And if not, why are we doing it? So these are important, I think, for each of our communities to get involved in. that sense of connection, and one of those priorities that they were talking about in the 5 non-negotiables, the 5th priority in the non-negotiables was participation, and that citizens are actively engaged in their communities and locally rooted economies. That's a key non-negotiable, I think, in order to adopt, and we've got good examples where that's in place. I wouldn't say that's in place across. We've got a number of communities very active, but a number of communities that are not, Steve, and I also think we need to look at those communities that are new communities that are emerging in Midlothian as well, and ensure that everybody has a voice. We had great presentation yesterday from our children and young people. We'd like to encourage that far more as well. And I know, Mary, through the partnership, there's been great participation with older people in order to shape older people's services too.
Thanks, Grace. I've got a question here from Jim Shervall. He said, do you see this as being closely aligned to the NHS aspiration to be an anchor institution?
Yeah, I do. I think all of our public sector services are anchor institutions, aren't they? And I think that a wellbeing economy, what we've found through the pandemic is the importance of all of us working together to put our people first. So absolutely, Jim, and I think there's a lot that all of our organisations can learn from one another in order to make a wellbeing economy happen. But Steve, I'm not going to underestimate how challenging this is. I think if it was something that was easy to do, there'd be a country that we could name across the world that had actually done it.
Yeah, and talking of challenges, here's a question that is definitely going to challenge us all by 2030. So Emma Henderson's asked, saying that really interesting presentation, thank you. In order for Midlothian to achieve net zero by 2030, what do you think some of the planned actions will be in practice?
Yeah, so I like I said, I don't think we can underestimate 9 years is not a long time. And if you think about some governments, they don't have that 2030 aspiration. We see 2040 in some organisations, 2050 in others. Habits, we need to change people's habits. If we don't do that, it doesn't matter what we put in place. Actually, people need, every individual, every community needs to take action, and it's not something that just governments, whether they're national governments, whether they're local governments. This is about everybody putting the pressure on to change habits. What we saw from COP26 was big ambitions at the beginning, but actually the complicated nature of talking that through in order to create policies is really challenging. So I think this is where people power really come into it. There needs to be demand for green energy, there needs to be demand for green travel, there needs to be demand for eating locally, shopping locally, all of these things. But actually what we see are people's habits still. You know, if you look at big companies like Amazon, people still ordering from large companies, people still not shopping locally, people still doing a lot of air travel. So we really, really need to shift habits. I'm not sure if we can do that in 9 years, but we need to give it a really good try, but we need to do that collectively together.
Okay, we've got another one. You say you have to make sure new communities have a voice. What exactly do you mean, and how do you find the people who are prepared to step forward?
I think that's a really good question, and that's one reason why we asked for assistance from Nesta. So for those that don't know about Nesta, Nesta is a people-powered results charity, and we wanted to find different ways to connect. I don't think this is just about going out to do a standard consultation. I think this needs to be getting word on the ground. I think we, certainly as a council, we need to get better about using new technologies, in order to gain people's views. I would say that sometimes we have the same people responding to consultations, so we do need to get better at both new and older communities. I think there's a lot of work happening within our early year settings, within our primaries and our secondary schools, that are managing to gain feedback from our children, young people and their surrounding families. I think there's been great examples. I referenced Mary before in terms of the work that's been happening with older people services. We need to get out there Steve, but one of our big ambitions is that local by default, that we begin to devolve a number of the services that we offer that are maybe centrally delivered services, say for example, centralised within Midlothian House. We want to embed those in local communities. So certainly from a council perspective, if we have a greater presence of people locally, for example, in our libraries and our hubs, would people feel more interested in coming in to drop in to make their voice heard or to ask for different services? But I would be open to any ideas that people have about how we tap in to those new communities, and particularly to tap into the voices that maybe we don't hear often.
One question maybe related to some of what we heard yesterday, but it's a great aspiration for the locality. But what steps will be taken to ensure that the voices of young people will be included in the planning?
Yeah. It's very interesting. People might be aware that there was a bill passed at Scottish Parliament called the United Nations Rights of the Child, and the UNCRC for short. That obviously has gone through the UK Supreme Court, but the ambition of Scotland is in full to implement the UNCRC. So actually the voices of our children and young people by statute will need to be taken into account, and our children and young people shaping services. We've got some really good examples of that in the creation of our new schools. We've got some really good examples of that taking place with the Pupil Equity Fund, but actually all of us, all of our organisations need to do that more, because that legislation, that UNCRC piece of legislation, will impact on every single organisation. So it's maybe something, Steve, we need to share that more widely so that people know the types of legislation that are also coming along. But actually that's really helpful, because it means that it shouldn't just be a consultation or an afterthought. That feedback needs to be built in to all of our planning. And it's back to what you said previously, Steve, about the Christie Commission. That was always built into the aspirations of the Christie Commission. And again, I think we're probably in our 11th or 12th year of that.
Thanks, Grace. I realise you're getting quite a few questions. There's still quite a few here. Are you okay to take another few questions? We've still got a bit of time for
Yeah,
that.
that's
Okay.
fine. And also goes into workshops, no problem.
Yeah. We can make a difference in Midlothian, but how do we influence and change the structural inequalities that exist and work against this well-being economy?
So it's a really interesting question, because there's a number of academics looking at this. If anybody's ever read any of Dr. Catherine Trebek's work, it's really, really interesting work. So she's engaged with the Scottish Government just now in trying to unpick everything that really supports the economy. Now, again, we still set both UK and Scottish Government budgets annually, although governments are trying to take a longer term view. I think that's exactly what we need to get into the nuts and bolts about how economic decisions are actually made, because they don't always put people first. The economic landscape tends to dominate the people landscape. So I think we really need to get into that difficult conversation. But there are 5 really interesting reports that the Wellbeing Foundation and Catherine Trebek and for the Wellbeing Foundation has written, and that may be something that we want to begin to share those reports to begin to get our teeth into what we really need to be asking to happen next. As I said, there are no examples of any country that have actually cracked this. But the examples talked about at COP26 really crystallise that, don't they? Different countries are at different places, and you saw that around the debate around fossil fuels and the change of language around that. So I don't think that we can underestimate how challenging that's going to be. But there was also another interesting book that I was reading, and that was talking about, it's called The Age of the Unthinkable. And that was talking about how some policy decisions actually accelerate things to happen. So the policy decisions that were put in place in the run-up to the economic crash that happened back in 2008, actually, with hindsight and able to analyse that, actually that accelerated that situation, as opposed to actually helped stop that situation. So I think it's something that we need to take great care over. This is very complicated, creating a wellbeing economy. as is ensuring that we don't widen that gap between the richest and poorest. And even if you take into account some of the major initiatives, for example, the Scottish Attainment Challenge funding, that was built in order to assist children and young people that lived in areas of the deepest poverty across the country. But actually, we're not seeing that narrowing that gap at all, because what that has done is focus purely on education and not the wider societal influences that we need to really grapple with and understand those. And I think we still take very silo-based decisions. So back to the comment that was in the chat earlier, holistic is the only way to go. But to try and get policy making tied up to be holistic is actually very, very difficult. Christie being a great example of a holistic policy, but we've seen multiple policies that fragment that one policy since that was actually created. Quite a long-winded answer there, Steve, but I've tried my best with it. It's really complicated.
Yeah, and there's another one about the environment, and I suppose it's maybe COP26 has done part of this job for us, but how do we go about changing people's habits and perceptions around climate change?
So again, something that's very tricky. And Mary, you'll remember when I think it was Jim Sherville had come along and we did that session on nudge theory. And I think that really does hold the key for us. Nudging is an amazing, I think, idea, and that's something that I think that we need to basically plot through how could we begin to do that, because just to tell people to do something, we all know that absolutely doesn't work. To change habits, it's about nudging, it's about gentle things, it's about peer pressure, peer support, all these other psychological aspects that we need to take into account. So I really wouldn't mind a CPP session that does nothing but talks about that, and maybe we need another workshop to think about what are all of the strategies within our toolbox that we could apply to this, because we really need to map it out. 9 years is a very, very short time, isn't it, to do something as ambitious as becoming carbon neutral by 2030.
Okay, thanks very much, Grace. I think we'll call it there. We've got a few minutes, but I suppose it'll give us a little bit of extra time to get people into the first workshop, and a little bit of extra time for that in particular. So thank you very much. There are probably a couple of questions, but don't worry, we can pick those up after the event. So thanks very much. Next up, we are going to be moving to a workshop session facilitated by our People Powered Results team from Nesta, so similar to yesterday. And a reminder that the access, you have to click the Zoom chat button at the top of your screen and enter the password you've been provided. It should also be available at the lower bottom part of the screen if you don't have it. So as quickly as you can, if you just head over to the Zoom rooms. Thank you.